Good evening, Ontario, and welcome to the Climate Night in Canada. My name is Amelia Rose Khan. My pronouns are they, them, and I acknowledge the land that I am joining you from is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Indigenous communities have called this land home for millennia, and we'd like to recognize how much we have to learn from their way of life and their respect for the land, water, and air, and on which our lives depend. I am the Toronto Tkaronto regional organizer for the Climate Hub Initiative, and in that role, I support activists in Toronto, plugging into opportunities to have a positive climate impact on our city through the Toronto Climate Action Network, the Green Neighbors Network, and other organizations. Alongside my colleagues, Lisa in the Western Greater Toronto Hamilton area, and Janet in southern eastern Ontario. We are here to help you navigate resources, troubleshoot problems, and celebrate successes as you help your communities to accelerate a just and equitable transition to carbon neutrality. For those located in northern and southwestern Ontario, you're in luck. Our former colleagues, Veronica and Martin, are both moving out of province, and we're seeking folks to fill their sizable shoes. If you're interested in supporting citizen-led local Ontario climate action, and you live in either northern or southwestern Ontario, consider joining the regional organizer team by checking out the role description at apply.climatehub.ca. We'll be sharing the link in the chat. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our host for the evening, a pillar of the Climate Reality Project Canada community, and someone that I know many of you will be familiar with, Todd Bersanti, lead mentor for the GTA. Over to you, Todd.
Hi, everyone. My name is Todd Barsanti, and I'll be your host for this evening's presentation. I live in Burlington, as we know it today, which is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Haudenosaunee and the Métis, our lands spanning from Lake Ontario to the Niagara Escarpment are steeped in Indigenous history. The territory is mutually covered by the Dish of One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and other allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we all gather is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Personally, I have been part of Climate Reality since attending a training in Chicago in 2013. In 2016, I took on the role of lead mentor for the Toronto area and have since played a support role for over 400 climate reality leaders in their efforts to educate and empower Ontarians to address the climate crisis. It's my pleasure to host this evening's presentation. Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions are going in the wrong direction, with the combination of buildings and transportation being the largest sources. Throughout our collective action, cooperation, policy based on science and climate justice, the trend can be reversed. Ontario municipalities have a huge potential to lead on climate action. With a relatively low carbon electricity grid and home to Canada's largest hub of service industries, they are technologically and economically primed to build back better. While energy efficiency measures continue to gain ground by virtue of competitive costs, citizens must raise their voices to ensure the inevitable energy transition is also just and an equitable one. At this point, I'd like to pass this over to Matthew Chapman, Community Climate Hub Manager with Climate Reality Canada, who will speak about Ontario and the National Climate League.
Thank you very much, Todd. It's great to be with you. I'm Matthew Chapman, living in Montreal, also known as Jodage, and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples. It's wonderful to be back in Ontario because that's where I'm from, just outside of Toronto, and nice to be speaking to the home crowd this evening. So I'll be presenting the National Climate League and the implications for Ontario. Here goes. The National Climate League is an initiative that is undertaken every year. It's just like the National Hockey League or any other league. We hold awards in February each year. And so we launched this just a couple of months ago. And who's behind it is kind of the network of the Climate Reality Project internationally. And here in Canada, over 1,400 people have attended the training either virtually now or in person with Al Gore. And if you look close enough and squint hard enough, you'll see Todd, I think, in this picture from one of the past one of the trainings in 2019 in person. Imagine that. I should also mention that the next training is taking place in October. It'll be a virtual training, and I'll put the link in the chat if you're interested in attending. So the season 3 standings saw well, the total database of standings now involves, I think, over 100 municipalities across the country. Most of them have little bits and pieces of data, and some of them have submitted whole slews of data that really allow us to dig deep into how they're doing and how they're comparing to their own historical performance, which is probably the most important because it's kind of hard to compare apples to oranges across cities. But we've done our best to choose indicators that are as comparable as possible. And therefore, we do identify which cities are leading, the cities with the little yellow wreaths, or laurels rather, around them. Cities or within each, so for example, in this case, in Ontario, London, Kingston, both taking, and Ottawa, pardon me, all three taking awards in the season's standings. Ottawa for affordable housing and road safety, Kingston for electric vehicle charging stations, and London for the cost per capita of fossil fuel expenditures. So what we're looking at in these indicators is things that people actually care about in their day-to-day lives, and things that are that are well correlated to reduced emissions. So things you want to see improved to improve your quality of life, and things that are going to help the planet cool itself down. As you can see also, the green circles mean that was the city's strongest area. So in the case of Toronto, transit was the strongest piece, and affordable housing was their weakest piece, encircled in red. In Ottawa, I mentioned the areas that they're leading in, affordable housing and road safety, and where they're lagging would be on shared vehicles. So yeah, how many shared vehicles like zip cars or communotos, or when they used to exist in Canada, car to go. Unfortunately, policy and economics have pushed some of these solutions out. And that's a little bit what this exercise is about how can we improve the circumstances such that sustainable solutions thrive and that people have choices to choose them, because frequently they don't, and they feel like they're kind of without other options. In Kingston, the weaker element was also shared vehicles as well. So moving on, the whole point of the initiative, as I previously mentioned, is kind of to bring this cartoon to life. I remember seeing this cartoon 5 or 6 years ago and think to myself, wow, if only we could get this message out there. You know, like, it doesn't have to be about climate change if you don't want it to be. It can be about making your community safer, making your community happier, reducing your energy costs through, you know, unlimited free energy from the sun and the wind. Yeah, and so that's what we went out, that's what we set out to do 3 years ago. These are the indicators. I won't go through them all, but they're all also linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. and the criteria by which we chose them are they politically relevant? Do people care about these things? Is the accessibility of the data relatively broad? We don't want cities bending over backwards to try to produce statistics that are arcane or difficult to obtain. The potential for these solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, whether or not the solution is under municipal jurisdiction, how big a stick does the municipality have, or a lever do they have to make change, and are the indicators comparable across municipalities? This is a chart for the climate hawks among us. So for the people who do care about climate change, and that's their kind of, this is the chart for them, to look at when you combine all of those solutions and you see progress, what direction are our cities going in? You'll see a couple of cities trending upwards, and probably surprising for many of you that Vancouver, we think of as the greenest city in Canada, or they brand themselves that way. However, their emissions have, for example, plateaued for the last nearly decade, and in fact have seen an uptick in recent years. Whereas Toronto, very encouragingly so, has seen a steady reduction over the course of the last decade, and partly, of course, due to provincial policy, but also due to the work of organizations like TAF and the retrofitting work that is done. So the Atmospheric Fund, we're really happy to have them on the webinar this evening. So I'll go through a couple of other indicators, highlights from Ontario. As you can see, you've got larger cities like Toronto, probably not too surprising, on the poor end of the air quality spectrum, and smaller cities and more remote cities like Sault Ste. Marie on the better quality spectrum, with a bit of an outlier in the sense that Ottawa performs very, very well on air quality. And of course, in this case, it's not always the municipality itself that has levers to control the winds, but there are certainly things that municipalities can do to improve air quality and educate their population about, better solutions locally, anti-idling laws, among others. Landfill waste, as you can see in Toronto, pretty good. Not the global, not the country leader, but certainly very close. So other cities can look to Toronto, whether it be a small city or a big city, to see what are they doing. And one of the things that Toronto is doing, and I believe Ottawa as well, is pricing trash at the roadside. So at the curb, you are paying every time you put out a certain amount of trash, depending on the bin that you purchase each year. So eco-fiscal policy, essentially. And that's what the standings are here to do. If you dig into the paper itself, into the standings themselves, you're going to find not only these graphics, but also kind of a description of what are the best policies, what are the practices that we can learn from, and then take to our city hall and say, hey, so-and-so is doing it, why can't we do better? Affordable housing, a really big one, particularly on the climate justice front. Making housing affordable is also a climate issue, because we are preventing or discouraging a sprawl into kind of high carbon lifestyles on the fringes of urban developments. So affordable housing, really important. Also, I think psychologically and sociologically very important, because it gives people the opportunity to think about longer term things when they're not held up against the wall, with debt over their head, or trying to pay rent that is, going up at exorbitant rates. So in this case, Ottawa took the title, and it was among the cities who experienced economic growth while keeping their affordability costs down. So the average annual increase, as measured by the average annual increase in housing, between 2015 and 2019. Of course, in absolute terms, Calgary and Edmonton did fare better technically, but their economies are in decline, or they're shrinking at this moment. So I think I've run to the end of my time. So I'm going to skip over the last couple of slides that I have to speak about public transit and shared vehicles, and just jump into this second last one here, around the question of how to get involved, how to take this information that we're talking about tonight, these solutions forward. Access the database, take a look around, take a spin in the data, use the tools that we've developed to help visualize the data, and then start talking to the media, start talking to your friends, start talking to your local councillors to say, hey, you know what, if this other city can do it, why can't we? Or, hey, our bike lanes have plateaued. We haven't moved on this indicator in the last 5 years. Why not? And you're going to see very quickly that the talking points of the politicians and the photo ops of themselves in front of one tree that they planted will become a little bit less convincing, less compelling when you have data to back up your advocacy demands. So thank you very much, and pass it back off to Todd for our guest speakers.
Matthew, that's huge. Thank you so much for that. The Climate League standings. I mean, I just have to, I have to commend Matthew on this. This is an initiative that he brought to Climate Reality Canada. The Canadian branch is considered a branch within the global community of climate reality, and we are the only branch, I believe, that is doing this type of work on a community level. You mentioned that there are over 100 communities that are a part of the league. Does that include rural areas as well? And are these indicators relevant to rural municipalities?
Yeah, there are a number of rural areas, so you can consult these standings or the data itself at stattracker.climatehub.ca. I'll put that in the link, and you can sort that list in all sorts of ways that you want. For example, sort it by municipality name, and you'll see very quickly that there are at least a few data points from about 100 municipalities, even though the large majority of the data is probably coming from 30 or 40 municipalities, and yeah, of all sizes.
Amazing. Thank you, Matthew. Your Herculean efforts that you've put forward here. And that was a question from Lynn that came into our Q&A area. So we've got another from Jane about some of the more details that you got into, but I want to move on to our speakers at this point, and maybe at the end of the evening we can bring in some of the questions that have come up. So we're going to move on to our speakers.
If I could, sorry. Also,
yeah, go ahead.
Just mention before I cut myself out, is that if you check your city name .climatehub.ca, then you will find data, the data that's been submitted for your city. I forgot to mention that in my presentation. So toronto.climatehub.ca, for example, or Toronto data, pardon me. You have to add the word data, torontodata.climatehub.ca. I'll put some links in the chat as well. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, add that to the chat, Matthew. I'm sure everyone on the call is going to be interested in finding out that information. That's great. We're going to move on to our speakers. We will hear from 3 speakers this evening, and we'll hold off on all of our questions and answers for after all 3 speakers have completed their presentations. If you have a question for any of our speakers, please feel free to put it into our chat feature or into the Q&A feature and here in Zoom, and we will attempt to address all of your questions at the end during our Q&A period. So for our first speaker, we have Mariam Shakirsfad, Carbon and Co-Benefits Quantification Manager at the Atmospheric Fund, or TAF as we'll call it. In her role, Mariam accelerates TAF's thought leadership in emissions quantification and supports governments in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area to find effective low-carbon strategies to meet collective emissions targets. She assesses long-term direct and potential carbon reductions and co-benefits of TAF's individual grants, programs, and direct investments, including projects being considered for approval, design, and lead strategic research projects on carbon and co-benefits. Mariam holds a PhD in transportation engineering from McGill University and worked as postdoc for the University of Toronto. Her research interests are in transportation and traffic analysis, focusing on greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution and exposure, and specifically public policy development to address community level health. Thank you for joining us, Mariam. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Todd, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. I'm Mariam from TAF. The Atmospheric Fund, or TAF, invests in low carbon solutions for the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. TAF's core mandate is to follow the carbon. So we publish an annual report that measures the carbon emitted in the GTHA. It's really important to understand the data to help us inform how and where we invest in climate action across the region. Tonight, I'm looking forward to sharing the results of our latest edition of our carbon emission inventory. This is our 3rd edition and covers data. The delay is due to the time it takes to assemble the data and analysis.
This report only covers direct emissions. Some indirect emissions, such as foods and goods produced overseas, are not in the scope of this report because of the complexity of the reporting. So accounting for these indirect emissions are certainly important, and we may be able to include them in the future editions. Most people may not know the biggest source of emissions in urban and suburban area like Southern Ontario. You can see here the large source of emission is building. This is primarily from direct use of natural gas and space heating for water, as well as the use of electricity in homes and buildings. The second largest source is transportation, mostly from personal vehicle, but also from commercial transport like heavy trucks and freights. The third largest source is heavy industry, which accounts for just under 20% of the emissions. And then remaining sources are solid waste, which accounts for about 3%, and agriculture, which accounts for under 1% of total emissions. Let's look at emissions from the whole region. The news is not good. The 6th region within the GTHA emitted 55.5 megatons of carbon. That's a significant increase of 5.2% from the previous year. Emissions are up in every region and from the two larger sources of emissions. So what's the trend? Clearly, we are not on track for 2030 and 2050 climate targets. This slide shows emission all the way back to 1990. And one thing that is immediately apparent is that between 2005 and 2014, we made a rapid and sustained progress in reducing carbon emissions in the region. And that was primarily due to phase out of coal-fired electricity, among other factors. But starting in 2015, the emissions flattened and began to trending upward again, which is hugely concerning. Some municipalities have their own targets, but this graph represents the course we need to be on to avoid 1.5 degrees warming. Basically, in order to reach net zero by 2050, we need to be reducing emissions by over 7% each and every year. So in a year that we are not hitting that 7% reduction, such as the most recent year, it means that each and every year now we have to work more to exceed that 7% reduction. So the largest increase in emissions was from the direct use of natural gas in homes and buildings, primarily from space and water heating, which has increased by 11% in the year. Now, a big part of that increase was that 2018 had a colder winter. So that means that larger demand for space heating, which is largely served by natural gas. But even when we normalized for weather, we saw that it was still a significant increase. Once we stripped out the impact of weather, it's largely associated with population growth in the region. So more people are coming to the regions, means more homes and buildings, and therefore increased demand for energy. Another source that is increased was electricity generation. And in this case, the rate of increase was absolutely shocking. We saw a 57% increase in emissions from electricity generation. This significant increase in emission is the result of only 5% increase in consumption. That's because the marginal source of our electricity generation right now in Ontario is natural gas. So anytime there is an increase in consumption, that's going to be met by natural gas generators. So this huge increase is quite concerning, although electricity is still relatively a small share of total emissions in the region. But based on latest forecast from ISO released February this year, it is expected to increase emissions from generating electricity by another 130% by 2030 and double again by 2040 in Ontario. That's simply no way to reach out those 2030 and 50 targets without changing where we are headed on electricity generation in Ontario today. Emissions from transportation also increased, also more modestly, about 1%. And this accounts for a little over a third of total emissions. But the challenging thing here is we've seen that transportation emissions consistently growing 1% to 2% each and every year. And this despite cleaner fuels and the average fuel efficiency getting better for each category of vehicle, there are more vehicles on the road with a growing population in the region. And also Canadians are addicted to big cars.
consumers continue to shift more and more towards larger vehicles like SUVs and trucks. So as the trucks and cars getting more efficient, but with the demand shifts from car to trucks, or the real efficiency on the road are getting worse. So this sustained trend in increasing transportation is also very concerning. Emission profiles are pretty similar across the region. What stands out is that Hamilton in particular has much higher industrial emissions. Also, to a lesser extent, Peel and Durham region. But you see that the major emission sources out there are pretty consistent, are building, the major source, and then transportation, very significant, and waste and agriculture being a modest share of the total emissions. Some of you might not know that actually here in Ontario, we have a lot of industry. That's about 20% of our emissions. This gives you a better picture of where industrial emissions come from. The single largest source of industrial emissions in the region is steel production, and almost half of industrial emissions for the region. This is centered in Hamilton, and it's a big share of Hamilton's emission profile. The next largest industrial source is cement production, primarily in Durham and Peel region, where there are significant cement plants and cement productions. And that's a very significant source as well. And then the remaining 30% is a mix of other industries across the region. So these are big challenges because cement and steel production are very challenging to decarbonize. But since we are really actually dealing with 3 plants, so there is a major opportunities to make a massive gain and emissions reductions across the region. So you're probably do. We all know levels of government and businesses must be involved. TAF's focus is on the big system changes needed for the deepest carbon reduction from the biggest source of emissions, buildings and transportation. We see 3 key policy priorities from to achieve net zero by 2050. There will be more actions, but we can't get there without these 3. First, we must get ahead of new buildings construction. We need to get to, so why are we building new buildings that will have to be retrofitted in 5 or 10 years? All new construction should be built to near zero emissions. Otherwise, it's going to be impossible for any regions to hit the target, their target. So the population for GTHA is expected to grow by 3 million people by 2050. That's equivalent to adding another Toronto into the GTHA. So just thinking about that for a second and think about the physical impact of that much additional development in the region to make room for those population growth. A few municipalities are leading the way on this with municipal green development standards. They are pushing the boundaries of the new construction. We need to keep moving on that as well on the provincial building codes. Then existing buildings are the next very priority, as they are the single largest source of emissions and there are huge carbon reduction opportunity. So that's about accelerating deep retrofit. And right now that's primarily happening through voluntary and incentive programs that many municipalities are starting to explore or offer, which as well makes housing better and more affordable, and it creates jobs. So there's going to need to be a transition to stronger policy tools for those deep emission reduction over the upcoming years to get us on track to hit the 2030 and 50 targets. And the final thing that stands out is the importance of clean electrification. It's so essential that we get our electricity supply on a trajectory towards zero emissions, because based on the current trajectory and Ontario's plan, natural gas for electricity generation will ramp up, and we cannot let that happen. And we'll need to get that under control by phasing out natural gas and get our space heating and automobiles electrified. And let's make sure electricity is clean in everything that we are doing. So those are 3 critical and enabling policy priorities we see coming out of the data. And that covers the summary of the emissions inventory. Thank you.
Mariam, thank you so much. You know, statistics, right? This is the stuff that is really at the heart of so many of the things that so many people on the call today are working hard to beat down. And I love that that you're able to break it down by region. I think it's fascinating to be able to see the different regions within Ontario and to see the impacts that they have. And personally, I mean, maybe I'm the only one on the call, but I was surprised to see that buildings are the #1 emissions generator, and that industry is #3 on the list. I would have flipped those two on the list, but it makes so much sense when you start to talk about how we the way we're doing new buildings and retrofitting is just such a critical part to trying to reach these goals. Thank you for that. So next up, we have Kate Berry, Program Director at Green Communities Canada. Kate works with school boards, municipalities, public health, and other civic organizations to promote active school travel and implements school travel planning in Ontario. She's a civil engineer and previously worked for Sustrans, a leading UK sustainable development charity, where she managed the design and construction of active transportation infrastructure. She has also worked as school traffic plan coordinator for the Upper Grand District School Board, working with schools to improve traffic safety, reduce vehicle congestion, and increase student active travel. Thank you for sharing Green Communities Canada's work with us this evening. Kate, over to you.
Thank you very much, Todd, and good evening, everybody. Let me just pull up my slides. Okay, so thank you very much for having me with you this evening. I'm really grateful to be here and participate in this conversation. So Green Communities Canada was founded in 1995, and we are a national nonprofit association of 20 community-based environmental organizations. And our vision is working together for a vibrant, equitable, and sustainable future. Our headquarters are in Peterborough, Ontario, and we have remote staff working across the country. The Green Communities Canada board is in the process of finalizing a new strategic plan for our organization, and with a much stronger focus on our collective impact and commitments to environmental justice. And our mission is to connect community-based climate action groups through a national network to share resources, to inspire innovative programs, and to elevate our collective impact. And our core staff work with our member organizations through a joint programs model. So GCC leads program design and develops central resources and communication strategies, and contributes, to funding. And member organizations do the delivery on the ground. They hire and manage staff, form local partnerships, secure local funding, do the marketing, engage volunteers, do the customer service. So we all like this joint program model because it really strengthens community-based programs. It improves quality, it provides much needed support at the local level, and it saves time and effort that's often invested in reinventing the wheel. So our main areas of focus, we have 3 areas: home energy efficiency, water management, and active transportation. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about those. Our home energy programs focus on providing residential homeowners with audits to assess energy efficiency of their property and support them to access incentives for retrofits. And this is certainly a program area that we're expecting to see a lot of growth in the months and years ahead. We're seeing the federal government is due to announce additional funding for these types of programs. So we're a little looking forward to that. Our water management programs are very relevant to climate adaptation and mitigation for Ontario communities as they address urban flood risk. The DPAVE Paradise program is an initiative that's been running for several years, and it's a really fun program. It's really popular with communities. It's really simply about removing paved areas, concrete and asphalt, and replacing them with green spaces, gardens, green infrastructure, and so on. We also have the RAIN community solutions. And that program is the way that we work directly with municipalities and environmental groups and property owners to reduce runoff and protect water quality by managing rain where it falls. So they really have these three key principles to that approach in terms of slow it down, soak it up, and keep it clean. And then our third program area is active school travel. We want to get more kids walking and wheeling. It's as simple as that, really. We've been working towards that goal for almost 20 years now, and gradually growing our program work. And we're fortunate to be in the position that we now run a provincial framework for active school travel in Ontario that's supported by the government of Ontario. And I wanted to talk about this area of our work a little bit more because it really ties with several of the NCL indicators, especially because children, as our smallest citizens with young lungs, they're more vulnerable to air quality, poor air quality. They're more vulnerable to, traffic hazards. So road safety is really important. We really need to provide the infrastructure of bike lanes and public transit and walkable communities to support our children to be active. So this is the scene that we would like to see at every Canadian school. People walking, cycling, scooting, using mass transit options like the school bus, and not a car to be seen in sight. But the reality is a long way from that vision, and this is from our data that we collect from Ontario schools. This is just over the last 2 years, and it clearly shows the majority of our kids are being driven to school. Very few are cycling, scooting, rolling, or using public transit. Second most popular mode is the school bus, and in third place is walking with about 25% of the mode share. And so I wanted to talk about the daily school journey because it presents a significant opportunity for decarbonization, at a local level, an opportunity for reducing transportation emissions, for improving air quality and improving traffic safety if we have less vehicles on the road. And our data shows that only 56% of students who live within walking distance of their school are actually traveling by active mode. So we've got a whole 44% of students in the walk zone who could be switching from the car to active travel. And of those kids who are actually eligible for the school bus, so they live too far from school to walk, only 70% of them are actually using this bus service that is provided to them. Presumably the rest of them are taking private vehicles. So both of those areas are contributing to those transportation emissions that Mariam talked about. So it was, curious, this is my data, but then what does that represent as an opportunity for reducing carbon emissions? So I had a go at doing some of my own calculations. So I'm just going to jump to this slide for a moment. So we have 2 million students approximately in Ontario in our publicly funded schools. And about 40% of them, 800,000, receive the bus service. They qualify for bus service every day. And so statistics from the Ministry of Education, that's 19,000 vehicles, school bus vehicles on the road every day. It's funded by an annual budget of over $1 billion now. And those buses travel every day. Each day they travel a total of 1.8 million kilometers. It's quite incredible. So if there's 195 school days per year typically, and I got some data from Climate Action Waterloo Region with a rate of emissions for a diesel school bus. It's typically 1 kilogram per kilometer. So if we multiply that all together, my calculation is that our school bus system in Ontario is emitting 351,000 tons of GHGs per year. I thought that was pretty incredible. And then if I just go back to thinking about those kids who are driving instead of walking. So from our surveys, we think about 760,000 students are driving by car. So again, by my calculations, they're doing that twice a day. and the average journey is about 0.8 kilometers. So based on that, I think we're looking at around 47,000 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per year from those car journeys to school. So there's a huge opportunity there for us to make a difference by thinking about how our kids travel. And finally, just, why do we want more kids to actually use the school bus available to them? Not only because it costs $1 billion per year for this province, but because if all of those kids on the bus are using cars, you potentially, multiplying by 10 the factor of emissions for that journey by having those individual trips. So the main way that at Green Communities Canada, how we approach changing travel behaviors for the school journey is through a process called school travel planning. And I don't have time to go into that as part of this presentation, but if you're interested to find out more, you can do that at our website, ontarioactiveschooltravel.ca. And so finally, I just wanted to really finish with a few calls to action for all of you tuning in tonight. Firstly, I recommend tuning in with Green Communities Canada. You can subscribe to our news through our website. You can find us on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. I recommend you look up where is your nearest green community, get involved in their local projects on the ground. If you're part of a local environmental organization, consider becoming a member of Green Communities. Connects you with like-minded organizations and communities across the country. We share ideas, passions, and inspiration, and work together for positive change. So you can find more information about both of those aspects on our website at the membership section. And finally, an invitation to consider joining our National Board of Directors. It's a collaborative and welcoming team spread across the country and all working together to increase climate action. Green Communities Canada has recently signed on to the federal 50-30 challenge. So we have a lot of work to do to bring more diversity to our board. We're seeking new and enthusiastic change leaders. And our current gaps include legal and human resource experts, Indigenous and youth leaders, and social entrepreneurs. So if that's of interest, please check that out on our website. The deadline for applications is May the 14th. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was so informative. From my own experiences, our children don't go to school in our neighborhood, and we drop them off at the school bus every morning, and then we take that time, my wife and I, to go for a walk every day and to get some exercise in. But in the schools that are in our neighborhood, it's crazy just to see the lineup of cars that are in the queue trying to get their children dropped off at school. And it's a social phenomenon, I think, and we already have one question coming up for our Q&A period at the end about if you have any insight into how we might address that. So something to percolate, and we can come back to that as we move into our Q&A panel. But thanks again, Kate, for that. That was awesome. Next up, we have Shailin Wabagijig, Program Director at Green Communities Canada. Shailin is one of 7 young people taking the Ford government to court for weakening Ontario's 2030 climate target. She grew up in the Rama First Nation, and her family is Algonquin from Timiskaming First Nation, Caribou Clan, German, and Irish. She resides in Nogujiwanong, commonly known as Peterborough, where she is currently working for the Kawartha World Issues Center as the Program and Outreach Coordinator. She most recently completed a Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, community project that worked to localize the SDGs while centering Indigenous leadership and prioritizing leaving no one behind. She works to empower youth and Indigenous peoples to steward the lands and waters for future generations. Thank you for being with us tonight, Shailin. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Todd. Anine, hello everyone. And I'd like to first thank the Ontario National Climate League for having me here. I'm going to speak to you tonight about my experiences and perspectives on advancing climate action. So first, a little bit about me and my journey. I always start with introducing myself in our language, Anishinaabemowin. So Anim Bojo, Shaylin Wabakijik, Indijnakas, Nino de Wazamin, Temiskaming, Donjaba, Atik and Dodem, Nogo Juanang, Indijnaka, and Honko Juanang and Dada. Sorry about that, I'm a little nervous. So I just said that I'm Algonquin from Temiskaming First Nation, Caribou Clan, German and Irish, grew up in Minjikaning, also known as Rama First Nation, you know it by Casino Rama. So since 2014, I've been living in Nogo-Juanong, Peterborough, that's Mississauga, Anishinaabeg Territory, Treaty 20 and Williams Treaties. So I came to Nogo-Juanong for my studies at Trent University. I have a BAH in Indigenous Studies and Philosophy. I graduated in 2018. So now I don't work for Green Communities Canada, as Todd said. I work for the Kawartha World Issues Center. I'm the program and outreach coordinator, and I've been volunteering with them and was on their board since 2017. So that's a little bit about me. I'm really passionate about, learning Indigenous knowledge and my language and furthering climate action and climate justice. So I told you a bit about my journey, and I also want to talk to you about 4 different things that I've been involved in and I've learned about during my short time in the nonprofit field. So first is Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, IPCAs, the Indigenous Guardians Movement, advancing the SDGs in Nogo-Juanong, Peterborough, and the Kawarthas. That was our project that we just finished in March. And then also the climate lawsuit that I'm involved in, and I'll tell you a bit about why we're suing the Doug Ford government for their inadequate GHG emission targets. So first, IPCAs. So on the right-hand side here, that's a cover for achieving the Pathways to Canada Target 1. That was achieving it for 2020. And so that is a really great report that will tell you all about IPCAs, but I'll tell you a little bit about it as well. So they're lands and waters identified by Indigenous nations that are protected according to their laws, languages, and cultures. So the Indigenous laws reflect our worldviews, and that's what we hope will govern through IPCAs. And our worldviews is that we humans are all equal to all other species, and that we are part of the environment and not above it. So treating that as such. And then IPCAs are an opportunity to bring together the federal, provincial, and Indigenous governments and nonprofits, etc., towards co-governing these lands. And that will also help us reach our 2030 targets by protecting more lands. And who's doing that here locally in Ontario? There's a 7-year project called the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. They're very active on this, and there will be a link in the chat to them if you want to learn more about what they're doing and get involved. Next is the Indigenous Guardians. So Indigenous Guardians honor our cultural responsibility to care for lands and waters. They manage protected areas, restore animals and plants, test water quality, monitor development projects, and maintain cultural sites, along with other things, I'm sure. The Land Needs Guardians campaign is helping generate long-term support for Indigenous Guardians programs and Indigenous stewardship. So they're doing really amazing things, as you can see in this photo, living out our traditions on the land with the land. And if you want to join that movement, go to that link. That will also be in the chat. So a bit about the project. I'm sure many of you know what the Sustainable Development Goals are, as Matt was talking about it earlier. So our project was called Advancing the 2030 Agenda in Nogo-Juanong, Peterborough, and the Kawarthas. So that was a project with us, the Kawartha World Issues Center, and Green Up, and it was funded by the SDG program funding through Canada. Yeah, so I'll just get into our key activities. So we created educational materials and in-school workshops we're delivering right now for the duration of the summer to contextualize the goals and our local priorities. Then we also established 5 priority action teams throughout the duration of our project focused on each of the identified priority goals. I'll get to more of that, what that means in a minute. We also identified the existing initiatives and partnerships in our community that are working to advance our priority SDGs locally. Then we also built bridges with trusted local organizations who are already supporting priority populations. And then as you can see in this photo on the left here, we hosted a second community forum in February 2021, centered on our priorities of leaving no one behind, which is really at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 agenda. And locally, in our local context, centering Indigenous leadership was also a main priority of ours. So that was really successful. I was the lead organizer for that and the host, and we had 300 registrants, and I think 220 of them came out through the 3 interconnected sessions that we had in February. So a bit about the project background. So we had another community forum in 2019 that raised awareness of the SDGs, and we learned together about them and identified those top 5 priorities. So they are Indigenous leadership, which we thought originally went with goal 17, partnerships for the goals, but we realized really it's Indigenous leadership, because partnerships is really about interconnections and partnerships between countries. Anyway, so also no poverty, quality education, clean water and sanitation, and climate action were our other priorities focused on the SDGs. So we formed the 5 diverse and inclusive action teams, so not the usual players, to promote further action and discuss our local context of who's being left behind in each of these priorities and how we can center Indigenous leadership in them to further them. So we partnered with the local First Nations, which is Curve Lake and Hiawatha First Nations here in Nokojuna. So the action teams were really the main part of our project, where we had a total of 15 meetings over the year. So that's 3 each, supported by 2 coordinators and volunteers for action team chairs, and 10 to 12 members in addition to us. And then the 4 teams were organized around the specific goals, but the Indigenous Leadership Action Team supported the work of the other 4 teams by bringing diverse Indigenous perspectives to each one of those issues. And we also had 2 Indigenous consultants and an elder advisor from the closest First Nations to make sure that although our intentions were good, you don't know if you might be infringing upon treaty rights. So it's very important to be in partnership with those local First Nations. So we have reports coming out on our Quick and Green Up web project web pages. So we have the 5 priority action team reports and the final project report, and also the Indigenous consultants report, which explains how to do Indigenous collaborative programming. So next, I want to talk to you about the climate case. Mather et al. That's Sophia Mather's last name. So the context behind this lawsuit is that the Ford government rolled back the province's previous relatively progressive climate targets and replaced them with woefully inadequate, significantly weaker 2030 target. So the impacts of this decision is harming and will continue to harm Ontarians' health and violate our charter rights to life, liberty, and security of the person. If greenhouse gas emissions are not reduced, as you heard in the previous presentations, young people and future generations, all of us, will be forced to bear the costs of climate inaction more than our predecessors. So we're saying they also discriminate against youth because of this fact. So that's why we're suing the Ontario government for climate inaction. So our case. So we'll have the chance to tell the Superior Court why Ontario's 2030 greenhouse gas emissions target is inadequate, unconstitutional, and must be struck down. According to experts, the climate science is clear. We argue that the Ontario government needs to create climate targets based on climate data and science, and we have a lot of climate experts backing us in this case. So how it's going, last year, the Ontario government fought to have this case thrown out in what's called a motion to strike. But for the first time in history, a Canadian court ruled that climate change can indeed threaten Canadians' fundamental rights, and that citizens have the ability to challenge a government's actions under the Charter. So that's really exciting. So we'll have a full hearing soon this summer, hopefully, online, of course. But this case has the potential to set significant precedents that pave the way for ordinary Canadians to hold their governments accountable for protecting their fundamental rights through climate action. So this is a really exciting first step for Ontarians and our shared future. So some final thoughts. Really, to me, the health of the planet and the future of humanity depends on the health of land-based Indigenous cultures and languages, because we have lived here the longest and we know how to live sustainably on this land. The continuance of our knowledges, or Indigenous people's knowledges anywhere in the world, means the potential for healing, protecting, and continuation of the lands, waters, and airs and non-human species. These are our relations. We don't look at them as capital or, above, but they are our relations, and we borrow these natural resources, relatives, from future generations, and we need to give that back to them when it's their time to live in this land and govern this land. So that's why Indigenous sovereignty to me is climate action. So Miigwech, thank you for having me here today, and back to you, Todd.
Thank you, Shaylin. I think your final thoughts there summarize beautifully why centering Indigenous leadership within the Sustainable Development Goals is just so important. And thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for taking on the Herculean task of taking on the Ontario government. It's one of those double-edged swords where it's unfortunate that it's the youth who are needing to stand up for these causes, but oftentimes when we see as a general public the youth standing up, we realize how serious this has become, and I wish you so much luck in this endeavor, because I think it has ramifications for all of us, and I appreciate the work that you're doing there. So thank you for that. We're going to move on to the question and answer period. There have been a few questions that have been brought up in the Q&A section here on Zoom, and Matthew has been diligently working behind the scenes to answer some of those questions right there in the Q&A panel. But there might be opportunity for you to also add your questions, whether it's in the Q&A area or in the chat feature here in Zoom. So please take some time now if you have any questions that you'd like to raise. We are going to spend about 15 minutes here in the Q&A time frame. So we do have some time. If you have any burning questions that you'd like one of our panelists, perhaps you can direct it specifically at Miriam, Kate, or Shaylin, and I'll do my best to try and pick up on these questions as they're coming in. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to start out with. Miriam, you were very much talking about the data early on with this, and I'm wondering how emissions data from the inventory can be used to influence decisions to get better outcomes when tracking climate change progress.
Thank you, Todd. Yeah, having access to reliable emission data is critical in tracking climate change progress and holding government accountable for the promises that they are making on climate change. All levels of government, from municipal, provincial, federal, declared climate emergencies, and a lot of effort are used to make that happen. But there are questions of, are these plans effective? Are emissions going up or down, or are they rising from transportation or from buildings? So to address these questions, we need reliable emission data. I can give you two examples of how TAF's recent inventory has already helped move the dialogue in the public opinion. There was recently a campaign to stop the proposed Highway 413 from being built in Ontario. And Environmental Defense used TAF's data to Peel Regional Council that shows emissions from transportation is increasing in Peel Region, and how that decision is sort of against cutting emissions and climate targets. And at the end, they voted oppose the highway and look at other alternatives. Or other example is we use this data in deputation in Mississauga for other motion calling for gas phase out. So what emissions data showing help us understand what we should do to hit our targets, and what should we do and what we pull back from doing, and try to turn emission facts into action at different level of government.
That's great. Yeah, that makes total sense. Thank you for that. Kate, we have a question that's come in from Alan. He is asking, do your presentations on school busing include the need to go electric with buses for fresh air reasons?
The short answer is no. No, we do. I mean, most of our work, we focus on active travel, on the walking and the cycling, and we don't actually study the busing side of things too much. But like, I'm an engineer, my background, and I kind of like looking at problems and solutions. And as you know, came here from the UK, the school bus system kind of really fascinates me as you know, kind of this institution of North America, but there's not actually much examination of the efficiency of this billion-dollar industry for the province of Ontario, and that really surprises me. So I like to kind of look at the data we collect at the local level in individual communities and scale that up to really think about, if you have a billion-dollar system that's only operating at 70% efficiency, there's a lot of improvements to be made there, and not, you know, it's not just about the money, but you know, the level of emissions. And there have been some trials in switching to propane gas fueled school buses, but that doesn't save a huge amount on emissions. I think the propane buses are maybe running at like 75% emissions compared to the diesel ones. So yeah, I haven't seen much progress in terms of looking at electrification of school buses. I think probably a first step would just be to make sure that we're running a more efficient system, and maybe encouraging more kids to walk rather than busing them relatively short distances, which is often the case too.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a question, Kate, I'll piggyback on that one and ask you another one. We had a question here that you answered in the Q&A section, but in case anyone hasn't noticed it, Sue asked you a question or made a statement really about walking school buses, which I thought was really interesting. She said that as a teacher, I told school kids I would meet them at a certain point every morning and walk to school through the town of Gravenhurst. This kind of initiative should be encouraged. And I think that's just such a lovely sentiment on her part. And I wonder if you have any follow-up on that.
It is lovely. And we so rely on and value people like you who provide those, community services. I guess what we want to happen is for some of those things to be institutionalized, that it's not reliant just on volunteers to to do that work. And when you think that we currently have a system where our government spends $1 billion on student transportation, but pretty much all of that is invested in motorized transport and school buses, which is only 40% of the student population. So we've got all that money invested in kind of the minority of the student population, and the students who all live within walking distance. There's no real investment in services for them, whether that's like pedestrian skills training or cycling skills training for kids, or providing staff as drivers of walking school buses. That has been tested, and I gave Ottawa as an example of where that has been successful. They're kind of re-diverting some of the transportation investment into the active modes. But we'd like to see that a lot more widespread, a more kind of equitable distribution of investment in transportation.
Thank you for that. Mariam, we have a question from Ronnie asking, when we consider bringing nuclear into the equation, how can we do adequate life cycle planning, including the safe long-term disposal of nuclear waste? Will hydrogen factor into future energy plans here in Ontario?
Thank you for that question. So yeah, also it is mentioned that nuclear, we all know that nuclear electricity is clean, and all the concerns are that because, as I also mentioned, the nuclear plants are going to be refurbished or retired, for example, Pickering. So we are concerned because that gap is going to be met by natural gas electricity generators. But that's why electricity emissions are going to increase. But regarding the waste, that's a great point. This is something that we haven't looked into it specifically, the waste, hazardous waste from nuclear plants. We do include a non-residential waste in each region in our emissions. But this, I mean, we haven't separated those based on the data we had. We don't have that sort of granularity to know how much is coming from the nuclear plants or elsewhere. But this is certainly something that is important to look at. I mean, of course, if we are looking at that life cycle, we cannot consider the nuclear plant as totally clean energy, but that raises the importance of looking into life cycle analysis of different emissions that we are considering. But we haven't looked at that in our inventory.
Thank you for that. Shaylin, I'm gonna send this question your way. You have a lot of experience working with kind of grassroots initiatives, and I wonder if grassroots organizations can work with municipalities to help curb emissions when funding is often so limited for these initiatives in the first place.
Well, I think that like grassroots organizations can work with municipalities. Sorry, was that the question? I was a little distracted.
Yeah. And if you have any insight into some things that have worked for you and some maybe creative ideas for how they might be able to get things going.
Well, I can only really speak to the experience that I have here. And here in Peterborough, we're really fortunate to have folks that are really taking the climate crisis seriously. So our municipalities are already, working towards the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a really excellent way to secure funding through those Sustainable Development Goals. There's a lot of resources on that, especially for municipalities. But also, I would just say, start with those grassroots organizations, reaching out to those who are around you and knowing the priorities of your community and bringing that forward to all levels of government, locally in the towns and then municipally. I think what really came out of the SDG project is the need for collaboration amongst jurisdictional neighbors and in all actors of society. We really need to collaborate with each other because that's where the real capacity comes from. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for that insight. Miriam, we have a question here from Alan. You put efficiency of new buildings as #1 issue. I've heard that the Net Zero National Building Code to be released this year leaves too much wiggle room on construction. Can you comment on this? Do you have any insight into that?
Sure. So I mean, as mentioned, we want to build the new buildings that are near net zero, and there a lot of efforts are happening in the green development and standards in cities, municipalities, to improve the codes, improve the standards, to build the buildings that are more efficient and I mean, be in a way that we don't need to retrofit them after 5 or 10 years. So, but yeah, I mean, this is where our policy team at TAF would be the best one to consult with regarding that new codes and standards.
Mhm. That's great. That's great. Kate, I'll throw this one your way. Do you have any additional advice for citizens who want to get more involved in municipal decision making around sustainable housing and transportation in their community?
Yeah, I think on an individual level, one of my recommendations would be to look to participate in if your municipality has any volunteer advisory committees. I'm not sure to what extent they exist in rural municipalities and smaller ones, but certainly if you're in the bigger urban areas, and I'm based in Hamilton, it has multiple volunteer advisory committees. So I'm a member of the cycling advisory committee. It enables me to get involved in, having sight of kind of the changes in policy that are proposed, the designs that are coming forwards, and we can help to kind of advocate for them to do more than what's planned. And I know that here there are other committees. There's a clean and green volunteer advisory committee. There's one for housing. There's one for Indigenous populations as well. So I hope that those opportunities would exist in many municipalities, because I think they're a good way to really get into the nitty-gritty and to interact with your elected officials.
That's great. That's great. Always any kind of way to I always say that we all know our elected officials' names, but how many of our elected officials know our names? And I think that's always kind of a way to get be that squeaky wheel, right? And be the person who is bringing these things to them. And so very insightful. Thank you for that. We have a request from Mr. Matthew Chapman to throw a question out verbally.
Yes, I want to ask Shaylin a question about reconciliation. And I've been kind of grappling with the idea of how do we go beyond what we're doing already, which is very little or almost nothing. And so could you give us some ideas or some proposals of transformational actions that we can take individually and collectively on the issue of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples?
I love the question. Thank you for asking, Matt. Yeah, so for me, I'm mixed and I didn't really grow up with my culture and my language, and I had to learn a lot. And even in my Indigenous studies degree, I was questioning whether I'm Indigenous enough and all of these things, and had a big learning curve in that. So I mean, start where you are and where you can, educating yourself always. So learn about the treaties and the history where you are. We have to do a lot of work to learn that, because it's not readily available to us. But it's really important to know that history, because then you can take the responsibility that we all have as treaty people here in Canada, to honor our relationships with the local First Nations and the lands and the waters that we live. So really that's reconciliation to me, is not just between people, it's also with the land and the waters. So I'm sure all of you are doing all that you can for that in that sense. But also recently, just touch upon one more point, is around land acknowledgements. So my friend from the UK who's volunteering with us, he asked a genuine question, what are land acknowledgements, and is it appropriate for me to provide one? And so I wanted to just say a little bit of background, is that our people are very generous, and you know, allowing whoever wants to come here and share with them. And we always welcome people to the territory before we start any meeting. And when there's nobody to welcome you to that territory, that's why we provide a land acknowledgement to acknowledge that we are, you know, visitors here, and also acknowledging the lands and the waters. So always know what treaty you're a part of, because we're all treaty people, and try and understand that relationship that you have in your local context. Yeah, thank you.
So helpful. Thank you, Shaylin. I've got one last question that maybe I'll throw to each of you as a bit of a lob ball question, but it's a question that came in by Lori when she was signing up to come into this evening. And Lori's wondering, and maybe I'll throw this one out to each of you individually. We can start with Mariam. Wondering if there is one thing within your purview of where your expertise lay. Is there one thing that we can all be doing, one action item that you would recommend for us to be doing to help decarbonize?
Thanks, Todd. That's a great question. I think there are a lot of really important individual behaviors, behavioral implications to climate action. So beyond driving less and taking less flights, you know, the number one thing that people can do is to get involved in civic engagement, find out what issues are at your city council and write to your city councilor. These kind of individual efforts actually can make the difference. Find out what is happening in your local community related to issues you care about. And letting them know here are some major policy issues that they think are important, and send your support, because you know, when councillors are receiving hundreds of letters or hundreds of calls, it actually does make a difference. So get engaged in the issues in your jurisdictions, and if you can make a deputation or write a letter to your councillor who is involved and stay informed on these issues, that would be great.
Awesome. Thank you, Mariam. Kate, an action item that you might recommend?
Okay, so I was mainly talking about transportation. So for sure, walk when you can. But I think actually, you know, when you look at Mariam's data too, and we think about our buildings and our emissions, I think that, you know, each to think about where we live and whether there's opportunities for us to increase the energy efficiency of our living spaces and our homes is a good place to start. And so maybe see if you can do an energy audit for your home, see if there are sort of incentives and retrofits available. But perhaps on a more municipal level, my understanding, this is a not very well informed response, but my understanding is that there is more federal funding coming for energy efficiency of buildings at several levels. And that includes funding for municipalities to set up their own local incentive programs for retrofits. So perhaps you can advocate for your municipality to be part of that, and for your municipality to offer local financial incentives for that to happen.
That's great. That's great. I really love that part of your presentation. As a homeowner, I'm definitely going to be looking into these home energy audits and winter-proofing programs. But trying to put the pressure on our local municipalities would be huge, also to help to support those initiatives. Thank you for that. Shaylin, final words to you. Do you have any action items that stand out to you that you would recommend for the attendees today?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, echoing what Mariam and Kate already said beautifully, I would like to say that everyone is in their own positions of power, and we have power with our community capital, with our professional life, and we have to seize that to do everything we can, because we are in crisis and we need to act like it. And also, whatever you can do in your position, doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a nurse or whatever it is, any impact that you can change, that you can take to create that change, I think that ripples out and inspires other people. And I've really seen that with the work that I've been able to do is, you know, people really care about this and will support you in that. So I think that that will ripple out and have a really good impact. Also, you can support our lawsuit at EcoJustice. You can sign a petition. There's so many different things that you can do. So I appreciate every one of you. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks for that, Shaylin. There was a question that came in, and I just want to address it, that you should be seeing, all attendees should be seeing in their chat. The question was whether or not this webinar would be sent out, and if they have permission to share it. And the answer is that absolutely yes, this webinar is available and will be posted in the coming days to the Hubflix gallery. And there's a web address there, hubflix.climatehub.ca. So before I pass this off to Matthew for our closing statements, I would just like to say thank you to all of our attendees tonight, and for giving me the opportunity to share this evening with you, and for Climate Reality and the National Climate League for creating this event as an educational event for all of us, and to bring these three wonderful speakers into all of our living rooms. And I've certainly learned a lot tonight, and I think there's always room for all of us to be continually learning and continually growing. So thank you to Miriam, Kate, and Shaylin. Matthew, I'll pass it over to you for our final statements for the night.
Thank you very much, all. And if I could just finish up with one last little call to action. I think community is a really powerful vehicle for change. So when people ask me, what should I do? I say, go for a coffee with somebody and make a plan together. Because you can retrofit your own home. You can start walking yourself. But when you start talking and collaborating with others and making change collectively, that's when we see tipping points happen. That's when we see friendships built around transition, culture change, when we build those bridges of friendship and relationship. So climate hubs are intended to do that. There are about 30 across the country at the moment, either starting up or fully active. And you're much obliged. It would be great to have all of you connected to your neighbors on that front. And then what feeds the climate hubs in terms of their advocacy kind of demands is the data. So either one helping us collect data by requesting that your city submit it, using the resources in the benchmarking section at climatehub.ca, or looking at the standings critically and providing us with feedback on how to improve them. Because between April and June every year, that's the period that we look at the project and we say, what's missing here? What can be better? What can be refined? How can we expand our impact? How can we improve the process? So the link to provide that feedback is also in that same section at ncl.climatehub.ca. And the climate reality trainings happen this year. It'll be in October. So the link is there, climaterealityproject.org/training. Thank you very much, everybody. And we'll leave you just with this beautiful image of our superhero changing Canada. And oh, that's it. Okay, I thought I had another final slide of the pale blue dot, but imagine the pale blue dot and all that we can do to keep her blue. All right. Good night, everyone.